Okay, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. It's 12 o'clock, and I want to welcome everybody to another Eye on Africa. My name is Awasar. I'm Assistant Director for Academic Affairs at the African Studies Center at Michigan State University. So this is Eye on Africa, the center's weekly speaker series. We're very delighted today to have Dr. Kara Moskowitz as our guest speaker. So welcome, Kara, and welcome, everybody. So a brief introduction. So Dr. Kara Moskowitz is an associate professor of history at the University of Missouri, St. Louis. She specializes in modern Kenya, international development, and decolonization. In her research, she looks in particular at how negotiations over transnational development programs shape states, citizenship, and political authority. She has publication in the Journal of African History and the International Journal of African Historical Studies, and recently published her first book titled Seeing Like a Citizen, Decolonization, Development, and the Making of Kenya, 1945-1980, with Ohio University Press in the New Africa History series. And that's also the title of today's talk. So Dr. Moskowitz, congratulations for your new book, and also welcome. We're very happy to have you today. So I pass it to you.
Thank you. Thank you for that kind introduction. And thank you to Awa and Nicole for doing so much to set up this talk, which has had to be rescheduled due to the pandemic. I'd like to thank all of you as well for coming and for inviting me to Michigan State. It's such a pleasure to be here, even if we're only able to meet virtually. Today, as Awa noted, I'll be speaking about my recently published book, Seeing Like a Citizen, Decolonization, Development, and the Making of Kenya. Let's see if I can share my screen. In a 1964 letter addressed to Kenya's first president, Jomo Kenyatta, two Kenyans complained that the poor had not received enough of the land distributed through resettlement programs, writing, quote, "Now if these acres are finished, what will you give us, we the needy? We are surprised to be told that we received independence. The poor voted to get a government which can eliminate bad things of the colonialists for them, yet things are getting worse than before," end quote. The writing effused disillusionment. Independence from British colonial rule had come just mere months prior. Anticipation had been great, however, and many Kenyans expected and made claims to land, development, and services. I begin with this vignette because it encapsulates the main threads of the argument of my book. First, decolonization and development were coterminous and co-constitutive. Second, in Kenya, as elsewhere, development programs and practitioners targeted the countryside and its rural citizens who constituted the vast majority of the populace. And in Kenya, like other African contexts, this was about over 90% of the populace who primarily resided in rural areas. Third, the 1960s moment offered extraordinary openings for political and economic innovation. Transnational development regimes attempted to expand into the decolonizing world. Transitional states set out to craft a new political order, and significantly, ordinary Africans actively intervened in deliberations over development. Though most Kenyans could not directly influence the development planning negotiated behind closed doors in Nairobi, London, Geneva, or Washington, they could affect the form and success of development programming on the ground in their communities, and they could also shift the national dialogue. Fourth, and most importantly, centering on the diverse set of actors negotiating development exposes constraints on state power and reveals how average people fashion citizenship in the post-colonial world. Much of the literature has emphasized top-down, high modernist interventions led by the state. Yet grassroots actors shaped and influenced development programs, thus limiting state control. In the process of pursuing development, rural Kenyans helped determine the policy priorities of the new nation, and they worked out how citizens accessed resources. In turn, they played an important part in defining the state-citizen relationship. Focusing on deliberations over the meaning and method of development deepens our knowledge of how global political practices came to be composed and recomposed on the ground in local settings, offering important insights into the texture of political life in the early post-colonial world. My research approaches Kenya's late colonial and early post-colonial eras as a single period of political, economic, and social transition. The years between 1945 and 1980 were some of Kenya's most formative for the establishment of development practice and a modern political order. Still, my study draws on deeper histories of migration, land, trade, and politics in order to enhance our understandings of both the continuities and the changes of decolonization. Given Kenya's overwhelmingly rural population and its economy's dependence on agricultural production, these historical processes unfolded in the countryside. Even so, the development landscape brought together multi-tiered actors, transforming rural development sites into cosmopolitan spaces. Thus, I take the local, national, and transnational as a single unit of analysis. Before I explore some illustrative case studies, I will lay out the broader argument of my manuscript and touch on the ways in which my work engages with the scholarly literature. From there, I will provide a short historical background. And then I will offer two examples. The first illustrates the Kenyan state's reliance on community organizations for development, and the second reveals how resistance to an industrialization plan produced new forms of authority. Finally, I will conclude with the broader implications of my work. Africans throughout the continent expected that independence would bring development. These expectations grew out of the post-war emphasis on development and welfare, which expanded state-led programs. The promises of African nationalists further contributed to widespread expectations for development and coincided with the establishment of the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF. The United Nations proclaimed the 1960s the development decade, the same decade that witnessed the rapid decolonization of much of Africa. And here on this slide, you can see the United Nations proposals for action for the development decade, alongside an image of the flags of 16 newly independent African nations being raised in front of the UN, which also again occurred in 1960. In Kenya, independence negotiations began in 1960, with debate centering on the constitution and on development. As Kenya gained formal sovereignty, an expanding set of external actors played a growing role in its affairs, creating and enacting development programs. These programs form part of a broader emergence of post-war development policies increasingly shaped by transnational institutions. The scholarly literature to date has highlighted, but overstated, the high modernist logic of mid-20th century states, offering few insights into how development was carried out on the ground or how it shaped the material well-being of the poor. Ordinary Kenyans were able to actively participate in development processes, at least in part because the state had more limited reach than previous scholarship has suggested. Kenya's post-colonial state was neither a monolithic nor a monopolistic institution. Rather, it was composed of dissenting actors who deliberated the merits of different economic models and disagreed on how to order the nation's policy priorities. In Kenya, as elsewhere, neither development practice nor theory was ever coherent, fully constituted, or unanimously supported. Officials disagreed not only on how to achieve economic growth, but on whether growth was even the ultimate goal. Neither development funding nor implementation was ever channeled exclusively through state institutions. Many scholars have accepted that in the 1960s, state actors became the primary agents of development. What often follows from this presumption is that gatekeeper states maintain centralized control over the flow of aid and resources, and in turn expanded and entrenched bureaucratic power. And so here the notion of the gatekeeper state comes from Frederick Cooper, which is a state that derives power and authority from regulating and distributing foreign aid. Or in other words, it's sitting at the gate and regulating what's coming in and what's going out. Yet the post-colonial state was limited by fiscal and personnel constraints. Though the state might have been an agent of development, it certainly was not the only agent. All developmentalist regimes did not inevitably produce a capacious bureaucracy that increased state power. Indeed, in early post-colonial Kenya, Jomo Kenyatta's state governmentality lacked instrumental or institutional heft. The government was financially constrained, and Kenyatta's ongoing efforts to centralize power produced conflicts between central and local administrations, generating contradictory outcomes. Physically present local governments were intentionally underfunded and eventually incapacitated, and the overextended central state entered into rural lives episodically and unevenly. During this period, state, non-state, and civil society actors together established new modes of governance and development. Development programs were often internationally financed, state-led, and locally implemented. Transnational institutions might have created the criteria which privileged some, marginalized others, and delimited the possibilities of development. Central state actors shaped policies within, but sometimes without, the constrictions of donors. They also frequently relied on local elites to distribute resources directly to rural supporters. At the same time, ordinary Kenyans sought alternatives to state-led aid offered by non-governmental organizations and community institutions. On the ground at the rural sites so central to Kenya's economy, both state actors and transnational practitioners exercised uneven control over development. At times, the state relied on local bureaucrats to serve as representative conduits and to implement development programs. Yet in many cases, bureaucrats were inadequately trained or inexperienced, or they lacked the resources to carry out their assigned tasks. With little oversight on the ground, some bureaucrats decided not to follow state directions, enacting nonconformist developmental visions. In other cases, when former colonial officials or white settlers took up bureaucratic posts, they symbolized the continuities of colonialism rather than the promises of independence. Beyond the state, new and old institutions, a blurred mix of parastatal, non-governmental, and community, took on legal, administrative, and developmental functions. These organizations included cooperatives, self-help groups, women's organizations, churches, ethnic communities, and voluntary organizations. And they were headed both by citizens and by non-nationals. These histories tell us not just about development provision or the making of the state, but also about the nature of post-colonial citizenship. Though citizenship in decolonizing Kenya was built through the promise of state resources, these resources were not delivered universally or equitably. Through negotiations over development, Kenyan citizens, state officials, and development actors delineated a spectrum of citizens' rights and duties and an irregular set of state obligations, differentiated by ethnicity, gender, religion, and class. As new inequalities materialized, Kenyans began expressing disparate ideas about citizenship. Men who became landowners often defined mwananchi, the Swahili term for citizen, in a possessive way. To be a citizen meant to be the owner of the country, whereas Kenyans with limited access to land and development often felt those exclusions were tantamount to exclusion from citizenship. For example, Kenyan farmer Eunice Mayo described citizens, quote, "It was those who were among me, but it wasn't me," end quote. In oral histories broadly, women and landless men rarely use the language of rights, possession, or universalism, instead articulating their marginalization. And here on this slide, you can see an image of a government pamphlet called Teach Yourself Citizenship for Self-Government. And one of the components that they're emphasizing is how to buy land in the highlands. So you can see that there's this connection being made between land ownership and citizenship. Unlike much of the literature on 20th century development, I approach this subject from the bottom up, offering locally grounded histories situated in national and transnational settings. The book thus balances attention between the bureaucratic logic of development and attention to the actions of rural citizens. To do so, I draw on a wide range of sources collected from 2 years of oral and archival research in Kenya, the United Kingdom, and the United States. While development plans provide technocratic insights, they tell us little about how programs were implemented or about how they were reworked on the ground. Competing ideologies tend to become flattened in reports composed to secure funding, to exhibit success, and to demonstrate consensus on best practices. Thus, in Kenya, I focused my attention on what I consider to be more nuanced sources, such as rural petitions to national and international leaders, local government meeting minutes, bureaucratic correspondence, and testimonies from commissions of inquiry. Oral histories are integral to my research as they complicate the state-centric accounts in public records and contribute insights into rural political imaginaries. I conducted more than 150 oral history sessions at 8 Kenyan sites. At British and American archives, I examined correspondence between Kenyan and British policymakers, internal World Bank reports, and NGO project evaluations. Though these sources provide a largely top-down view, they also sometimes expose fractures within institutional bodies. The combination of multi-sided archival and oral sources allows me to offer a rich picture of engagement among rural, state, and transnational actors. My research focuses on the rural, ethnically diverse district of Uasin Gishu on the western edge of Kenya's Rift Valley highlands. And so in this map, the Rift Valley is the region in orange, and Uasin Gishu sits on the central western edge of the Rift Valley. And then the second map gives you a better sense of the boundaries of Uasin Gishu. The inlay shows you kind of Kenya as a whole and where Uasin Gishu is situated. And then the map shows you Uasin Gishu, as well as the specific sites in which I conducted oral histories and where some of the research is located. In Uasin Gishu, rain falls reliably, the soils are arable, and the high altitude makes for temperate weather well suited for farming. Long before colonialism, this fertile land drew agro-pastoralist societies with political institutions founded upon personal relationships. At the turn of the 20th century, the British colonial army arrived. Despite sustained resistance, the colonial state forced Africans into native reserves. European settlers then appropriated the land and established an economy based on the large-scale farming of cash crops, such as coffee and tea, and dependent upon African labor. And so this map is obviously a satellite map, and it gives you a sense of the diversity of Kenya's ecology. And the areas in green towards the west are the areas that are the highlands around the Rift Valley. And again, Uasin Gishu lies on the western edge of the Rift Valley highlands. World War II served as a watershed in both the colonial administration and the labor system on European farms. In 1940, the British Parliament passed the Colonial Development and Welfare Act, which emphasized state-led development programs. World War II also catalyzed a new wave of prosperity for European settlers. White farmers used the income to mechanize their farms and then expelled African laborers. Upon returning to native reserves, former laborers could not access land. Disillusioned youth in central Kenya began organizing the Mao Mao Rebellion in the late 1940s, the most serious resistance to colonialism in Kenya's history. Kenya's first land reform program in 1954 grew out of the Mao Mao state of emergency and the new developmentalist colonial rule. And here development also served as a counterinsurgency strategy in which the state was trying to create a class of more conservative landed African farmers who would have similar interests to white settlers. In 1960, Kenyan leaders and British officials began negotiating independence. The most heated debates revolved around the structure of the post-colonial government, which would determine who controlled the distribution of land and development resources. These were especially contentious issues. Only a small portion of Kenya's land is suitable for agriculture or intensive grazing. European settlers had taken the most fertile regions during colonial rule, and different ethnic groups articulated competing claims for land. In 1962, prior to the resolution of these questions, the British colonial government and the World Bank began implementing the Million Acre Scheme, the largest land transfer and resettlement program in Kenya's history, just one of many late colonial and early post-colonial programs aimed at restructuring land tenure, redistributing land, and fostering agricultural development. Kenya gained independence on December 12, 1963. At the close of the independence negotiations, the government framework remained ambiguous. Though the final conference had called for a federal government, Kenyan elections placed Jomo Kenyatta and his KANU party, advocates for a centralized government, in power. By 1964, Kenyatta abolished the federal constitution, the opposition dissolved, and Kenya became a de facto one-party state. Though Kenya would remain under one-party rule for much of the rest of the next 3 decades, state actors and Kenyan citizens remained fiercely divided over whether and how resources should be distributed. The rapid amendments to the state structure contributed to the emergence of an ad hoc form of governance and an increasingly transactional post-colonial milieu. This setting was further complicated by the presence of transnational institutions, the former colonial power, the British, and competing Cold War powers. Moving into my first example. 2 post-colonial programs, self-help and farming cooperatives, reveal how the Kenyan state relied on local communities and an incipient form of civic life in order to create development. On June 1st, 1963, the day Kenya attained internal self-government, Jomo Kenyatta declared, quote, "We must work harder to fight our enemies, ignorance, sickness, and poverty. I therefore give you the call, Harambe, let us all work hard together for our country, Kenya," end quote. Harambe, which is a Swahili word meaning to pull together, became both a rallying cry and the maxim of Kenyatta's presidency. It would also become synonymous with self-help. Like Kenyatta's speech, self-help encouraged Kenyan citizens to contribute to nation building, specifically by initiating local development projects. State actors promised Kenyans that after they did their part building roads, schools, and hospitals, the government would provide them with additional funding, materials, and if needed, technical experts and staff. Implicit then in Harambe was the notion that citizens had to fulfill their duties in local development before they could make claims to state assistance. And here you can see Harambe on Kenya's coat of arms. Self-help relied on local communities and a form of emerging civic life in order to create development. While this program placed a heavy burden on citizens, the sheer number of self-help projects carried out after independence suggests that many local groups accepted the work. Ultimately, Harambe came to occupy an ambiguous arena, often government orchestrated, but just as often largely absent of government support and dependent on citizens' initiative, capital, and labor. In articulating the role of average Kenyans in these processes, state actors advanced an idea of post-colonial citizenship that stressed duties over rights and made citizens, quote, responsible for the work of government. A few years after independence, the landscape throughout much of Kenya had transformed as new locally initiated schools and hospitals suddenly dotted the countryside. Though communities built schools and hospitals at a frenetic pace, these buildings often sat silent and empty for years without teachers or nurses, desks, or medications, expenses that fell to the central government. The empty schools and hospitals revealed disputes between local self-help groups and state actors about the government's responsibilities and about the rights and duties of citizens. Increasingly, the state intervened not to offer funding, but instead to regulate community efforts or to induce local groups to take up nationally prioritized projects. And here on this image, you can see a photo of one self-help school in Western Province. Mobilized by their belief that they had the right to choose local development priorities, Kenyans enthusiastically created self-help projects. While officials publicly lauded the importance of self-help in Kenya's development, bureaucratic records disclose increasing concern about the government's inability to control local groups. In response to the explosion of self-help programs, Kenyan officials asserted in increasingly dogmatic terms that self-help required active supervision. In a 1967 letter, the personal secretary for the Ministry of Cooperatives and Social Services noted, quote, "haphazard projects can hinder rather than help," end quote. He continued in the same vein. Development can be viewed as a jigsaw puzzle where every piece must fit into its own place. Consequences must be taken into account, end quote. Tensions between local charge and national coordination had started to emerge. Self-help groups contested state infringements on local sovereignty by moving forward with their projects nonetheless. In one instance in Chekalini, a village in Western Province, a self-help group continued running a health center despite official efforts to suspend their operations. The provincial medical officer wrote in 1966 that the self-help group had not sought the Medical Statutory Board's permission to open the health center, and without board approval, the center was operating illegally. The medical officer's orders to close the health center and, quote, "see that the premises are demolished," achieved little. The Chekalini group carried on with their work despite the officer's directive. The inability to control community development programs stemmed, at least in part, from the absence of state officials at self-help sites, the result of a skeletal bureaucratic staff. For a government that hoped communities would take on vast development responsibilities, but also follow guidelines with little oversight, growing local defiance signaled trouble. Indeed, Kenyan groups tirelessly carried out their self-help projects, especially school construction, though the Kenyan state increasingly denied them financial support. A 1968 memorandum on self-help reported, quote, "the number of schools undertaken continues to grow substantially. The thirst for education for the children of Kenya is apparently unquenchable, despite the problem of meeting the recurrent costs of such schools." And of course, those recurrent costs were the responsibility of the central government, things like providing teachers and staff and desks and things like that. Increasingly, local groups contested how the government defined its obligations. According to the minutes of a 1967 self-help committee meeting, groups began projects, quote, "not out of their own need, but with a false hope that by doing so, they will be able to secure government aid." By 1969, a provincial community development officer commented on the, quote, "ill-conceived ideas that the people have done so much and the government so little," end quote. In building schools and health centers without definite assurance of funding, Kenyan communities made claims for these services, and they asserted a vision of a more robust government assistance. Kenyans made claims to state aid, but they also sought assistance from non-state actors. Missionaries played an active role in education and healthcare, and as the 1960s and 1970s wore on, a different set of non-state actors began helping to deliver social services. UNICEF provided aid to self-help projects as early as 1961, and CARE and the Freedom from Hunger campaign, along with a number of other newly established NGOs, also furnished assistance. The majority of external aid for self-help projects in the early independent era came from other nations. By 1964, Kenya had received bilateral offers of assistance for self-help from more than 20 nations around the world, including the United States. Encounters with international officials occurred episodically and unevenly, but those Kenyans who benefited from foreign aid could contrast international donations with Kenyan government refusals to finance projects. Despite their promises otherwise, officials pushed state development priorities onto self-help groups while withholding funding for locally initiated projects. Many rural Kenyans contested the state at self-help sites, and in doing so, they proffered different developmental visions, asserted their local autonomy, and pressed the state to take on certain obligations. The independent state promoted the creation of other community organizations in the name of national development. Kenyan agricultural cooperatives functioned as marketing societies, creating a direct channel between rural farms and state markets. Co-op members were required to sell their produce to their societies. The cooperatives then sold these products onto state marketing boards. Marketing boards paid the cooperative societies, and after deducting fees, taxes, and loans, the co-ops then paid the individual farmers. One of the objectives was to simplify the collection of taxes and loan payments. It was the cooperative committee, not the general membership, that conducted this business. The committee members, who were community residents, not bureaucrats, were wholly entrusted with overseeing cooperative agricultural production and marketing, and with managing cooperative finances. In liaising between citizen and state, and in taking on these governing, administrative, and developmental functions, cooperative committees represented another emerging form of civic life, one vested with enormous responsibilities. In decolonizing Kenya, debt collection became especially important. Independence negotiations had stipulated that land transfers from European to African owners could only take place through voluntary market value sales. So in other words, there was an agreement that there would be no land expropriation, but capital investment and creditworthiness then became a prerequisite for citizens' rights to resources. This condition catalyzed the incorporation of small farmers into global lending economies, as the Kenyan Treasury offered land loans to citizens by taking on debt from international financial institutions. Through cooperatives, the government attempted to ensure higher rates of repayment, but in the process, vested community organizations with immense responsibilities and created a site of state building outside the state. The Kenyan state devolved power, but remained an interventionist institution by proxy, entrusting community organizations to manage part of the economy. Kenya's cooperative history challenges the oft-accepted notion that developmentalist states expanded and exclusively relied upon bureaucratic power. In fact, cooperatives provided Kenya's understaffed bureaucratic machinery with an alternative administrative institution. Policymakers attempted to recast state power through cooperatives, and they also attempted to recast citizenship, with special attention to proper economic conduct. State actors crafted a concept of citizenly duty which entailed responsible borrowing. Rural Kenyans responded to this and other incursions on their personal economic autonomy by instead asserting their rights as citizens to self-determination. Kenyan farmers thus sold their produce outside their cooperatives when they believed it was to their economic benefit. But in effect, they missed loan repayments since the cooperatives made automatic deductions. The state allowed cooperative boards to work largely unsupervised. Many rural farmers noted that cooperative management worsened over time and said they did not receive fair payments for their produce. While low payments could result from mismanagement, they were also a product of the costliness of administering cooperative services. In this context, many farmers started selling their produce to private traders who offered better prices. Though many farmers recounted malfeasance in oral histories, cooperatives were local institutions with great variation. And so there were some Kenyans who recounted positive experiences, noting that co-ops helped communities work together and that they acted transparently. In some of these cases of alleged misconduct, Kenyan communities requested government investigations. Former co-op members I spoke with recalled that they had to complain in order to convince officials to audit their organizations, something that was supposed to take place on a yearly basis regardless. But the state lacked the qualified manpower to even staff its cooperative department. In 1970, for example, 10 cooperative officers monitored 130 cooperative societies. In other words, there was one cooperative officer traveling on foot or by bicycle for every 13 co-ops, most of which had thousands of residents and thousands of acres of land. The subsequent low rates of repayment put the Kenyan state in a difficult position. Government correspondence in 1965 noted that land payments would, quote, more than any other single item affect the country's credit ability for new loans. And here's an image of Burudi Nabwera, who was then Kenyan ambassador to the US and permanent representative at the UN, signing a 1964 loan agreement with the World Bank. And so this was something that was very concerning, especially to the Kenyan Treasury, their ability to access new loans. Officials attempted to improve loan repayments initially by relying on a didactic strategy, making clear, quote, that land was not given for free, but that settlers shall have to pay the arrears forthwith or run the risk of losing their plots, end quote. Despite this education about suitable economic behavior, and despite continual threats of eviction, little changed. By the end of 1970, Kenyan settlers had paid only 54% of the total amount billed. State efforts to forge a citizenry composed of loyal borrowers were largely ineffective. Kenyans asserted their rights to economic liberties when they chose where to market their products and how to spend their money. In refusing to repay their loans, they claimed the right to certain standards of living. Thus, they prioritized purchasing basic household goods, accessing important services such as healthcare and education, and participating in important social rights like weddings, births, and funerals. Most generally, they claimed the right to make their own financial decisions. As one co-op member, Patrick Ziezi, recounted in an oral history, quote, "We were paying what we thought we had." Both cooperatives and self-help groups were community organizations occupying a liminal space. They engaged with, but operated partially outside the sphere of the state. In the early post-colonial era, citizens and community groups shouldered enormous burdens in local development. When they built schools, roads, and hospitals, Kenyan self-help groups asserted their rights to local sovereignty, but increasingly they called upon the state to aid their projects. With the government often unable to provide help and widely perceived to be offering limited assistance inequitably, many residents came to believe that the state had not kept its promises to help those who first helped themselves. Self-help shaped expectations for more limited state obligations and pushed rural Kenyans to look to international donors and to strengthen ethnic affinities that could provide protection and assistance. The Kenyan state entrusted cooperatives with governance and credit brokerage. Cooperatives thus conducted some of the work often attributed to a state, but they did so at an arm's length from state institutions. Through cooperatives, non-state actors mediated the policies and interventions of the Kenyan state and transnational organizations. These policies became transformed yet again when rural citizens made quotidian economic decisions that reverberated in macroeconomic settings. Though cooperatives and self-help reveal the devolution of state power to civil society, both programs also engaged in transnational spaces. In addition, both helped reify social hierarchies, often marginalizing women, the poor, and ethnic minorities, which I'm happy to speak more about during the Q&A. The second example turns to a hotly contested development program. In the 1960s and 1970s, Kenyan squatters resisted government attempts to start a paper factory. Squatters refused to move, they uprooted trees intended to supply raw materials to the factory, and they sent multiple delegations to President Kenyatta, demanding of him, "Are you planting trees or are you planting people?" Squatters were asking Kenyatta whether he supported a forest and paper industry program or a land settlement program, since the two projects had been planned on the same land. Through the struggles over this development program, squatters played a role in negotiating new forms of political patronage and in defining presidential authority. Contending visions of development created a deadlock in Turbo, Kenya, the site planned for a 60,000-acre afforestation program. The Kenyan government had initially purchased land in Turbo, Kenya from European farmers and promised it to Nandi squatters under a land settlement program. However, in 1964, the Kenyan cabinet reversed its decision and agreed instead on the Turbo afforestation scheme to establish forest plantations on the very same land in order to provide timber for a planned paper factory. And this map shows the location of the paper factory, but one of the things that it doesn't show as clearly, which I'll talk about a little bit more in the next couple of minutes, is the geographic and ethnogeographic complexity of this region. And part of the reason that squatters were so upset about the proposals is that the land settlement scheme was located in the Rift Valley in what was considered Nandi territory, whereas the paper factory was located in Western Province in what was considered Luya territory, and would thus take land from the Nandi but offer jobs to the Luya. Once lauded by officials as, quote, the biggest single project ever undertaken, the paper factory characterized the new government's lofty development goals to generate economic growth and employment. For many rural Kenyans, though, the promises of independence entailed greater access to agricultural land. Making matters worse, the optics of this program were bad. The Nandi community found it especially egregious that the government went back on its promise to give them land at Turbo in order to create a development program that offered jobs to the Luya. Land and ethnic competition were the broad fault lines along which squatter resistance ran, but the particularities of the program also inspired squatter contestation. Most squatters recalled feeling disbelief that trees could ever be more important than people. Thus, they contested the forestry program from its start and flooded into the area in order to resist its implementation. And just to give you a sense of this, from 1965 to 1969, the number of people living in the area ballooned from 1,500 to 5,000. So it wasn't just people who were already living there, but there are people who intentionally moved in to try to block the implementation of the program. As a result of effective squatter resistance, in 1966, the Ministry of Economic Planning and Development described the program's progress as depressing. After meeting multiple delegations of squatters, President Kenyatta intervened in 1968, ordering that a portion of the planned forest be moved and that a settlement scheme be carried out instead. Kenyatta's directive did not resolve the crisis, as new squatters refused to leave new forest sites, and government officials continued to argue over whether resettlement or industrial development was more important to the national interest. Land overshadowed most other political issues in Kenya during decolonization. Many Kenyan policymakers were skeptical of the economic benefits of giving small plots of land to Kenyans. They believed in the importance of economies of scale and assumed that rural Kenyans had little agricultural knowledge and would make unproductive farmers. Poor landless Kenyans became chief recipients of settlement land nonetheless, but mostly out of concern that they constituted a security risk. The state redistributed land to the rural poor, in other words, as a preemptive strategy for diffusing unrest, but not as a means to achieving major economic development. Despite these programs, the new Kenyan nation remained beset by landlessness. In absence of adequate land for Kenyan farmers, the state turned to job creation. Kenyan government bureaucrats and international development practitioners generally supported industrial programs over squatter settlement because they saw industry as a more sustainable solution. The paper mill represented one such solution. The proponents of afforestation characterized the decision to prioritize industry over settlement as a more sophisticated approach to development, which would lead to progress for the entire country, as opposed to a small number of settlers. Rural imaginaries of the post-colonial order diverged from this vision of industrial development as panacea. Paul Kipkorir-Boit, then Provincial Commissioner of Western Province, summed up the government's difficult position in a 1970 letter, noting that as long as there were squatters, quote, the public just do not understand why certain portions of land should be afforested. In the same letter, Boit wrote, economically, of course, provision of employment has to rank fairly high as well in our priorities, but the prevalent sensitivity on land will always make any proposals to expand plantations of forests to be viewed with indignation, end quote. Squatter resistance to the implementation of the forestry program grew out of popular post-colonial ideologies in which independence, land, citizenship, and development were all intertwined. Rural aspirations were tied to land, but rural anxieties were tied to ethnic competition. The inception of the forest and paper program occurred in a setting already rife with feelings of regional antagonism, and turbo afforestation magnified Nandi concerns about marginalization. Squatters did not believe the paper industry signified development because the factory was located outside the Rift Valley. Kipto Arap Maina, a Nandi farmer who has lived near Turbo Division since independence, articulated this sentiment. Something like Pan-African paper, which is the name of the paper mill, in Webuye benefits those people in Webuye alone. So how do I take it as development if it's not of direct benefit to me? Other Turbo interlocutors also said they believed the paper industry would benefit only the Luya in Western Province. The long-standing competition for land in the Northwest Rift Valley Highlands between Kikuyu, Kalenjin, and Luya, and then later between forest and settlement, created an atmosphere of anxiety and vulnerability, which buttressed squatter mobilization against government attempts to seize land. In spite of the controversy, in 1968, the project garnered World Bank funding. The World Bank required that half the timber come from within a 25-mile radius of the factory. Stipulations created to minimize transportation costs and maximize profitability. World Bank conditions gave Kenyan policymakers few options for where to establish forest. These options became further limited as squatters achieved greater victories through their resistance. Kenyatta continually ordered the government to convert more and more planned afforestation areas back into settlement schemes. The Ministry of Natural Resources sought new land for forest, but they encountered the same problems everywhere. The ministry's permanent secretary complained in a 1970 letter, quote, "By losing 22,000 acres to settlement, the land available has now been reduced to 25,000 acres. We were asked to find alternative suitable land to be bought for the forest scheme, but each time we have met with difficulties. We lost 2 farms to squatters last year, plus the national farm. The local people simply moved into the farms and refused to leave. The national farm was invaded by armed men and we were forced out," end quote. A sense of resignation following these repeated defeats is evident. By April 1971, the World Bank Forestry Project Manager noted that only 15,000 hectares of the required 30,000 had been purchased. The manager added that Kenya's Ministry of Natural Resources had tried to acquire additional land, quote, "but with heavy pressures from other interests, it is anticipated that great difficulty will be found in achieving the target," end quote. Incompatible visions of Kenya's economic and political future often translated into conflict at development sites. Squatters in Turbo contested national policy on land and resource distribution by undermining government attempts to create new forests. Squatter visions looked more like this image from a settlement scheme rather than an industrial development program. In response, the central state, which was vulnerable to public outrage over land inequality and to fractures among government ministries, made shrewd but largely superficial compromises. The assurance of alternative settlement represented the first of these compromises. A longer series of negotiations with local, national, and international actors would follow. The state coupled such negotiations with efforts to police squatter sabotage, and these encounters became integral to affirming and consolidating political authority. The Turbo conflict and other development conflicts like it reordered political relationships among rural groups, politicians, government bodies, and international institutions. In resisting the physical planting of trees and in building partnerships with the political elite, squatters spurred government debate. Central government actors became intensely divided over the program, with some supporting the squatters in the name of a welfare-oriented, redistributive state, while others supported the forestry program, arguing that it was in the new nation's interest to develop growth-oriented industry. Local and national leaders even supported squatters directly on the ground. Politicians' involvement reveals how jockeying for power in a one-party state shaped the exercise of authority in local settings. Politicians build up popular support and political legitimacy not from their party associations, but from their personal and visible distribution of resources to citizens. When national figures entered into local development politics, it was often to the mutual benefit of the politicians and the local groups. Politicians gained supporters while communities gained access to development. Physical meetings between political leaders and Kenyan citizens shaped notions of authority. This was particularly true with regard to President Jomo Kenyatta himself. In describing the story of their resistance, former turbo squatters stressed Kenyatta's role. Each recounted asking him, "Are you planting trees or are you planting people?" And a tenor of intimacy suffused their narrations. Turbo residents not only recounted meeting with Kenyatta, but they remembered that moment in particular as a turning point. Indeed, Kenyans throughout the country believed in and often experienced the power of bringing a grievance directly to Kenyatta. Many Kenyans thus came to think of Kenyatta as the ultimate embodiment of the nation. Kenyatta was known popularly as Baba Taifa, father of the nation, and Mzee, a respectful name for an elder. And here you can see in this image on the slide that he's literally depicted as equivalent to the nation. Many Kenyans credited Kenyatta with bringing independence and giving out land. This emblematic role allowed Kenyatta concrete presidential powers. In the Turbo case, he altered a World Bank-funded national development plan by making promises to squatter delegations. Kenyatta's ability to pledge land to Kenyans without consulting the government illustrates his personalized authority. Indeed, much of the president's power derived from the fulfillment of personal promises. The events at Turbo tell us much about Kenyatta's style of government, but simultaneously they reveal how citizens accessed the state through Kenyatta himself. Turbo reveals how local communities came together to reshape national development plans, very often through their resistance and their willingness to enter into patronage relationships with national elites. In Turbo, squatters played a decisive role in deciding whether and where the state-sponsored and World Bank-funded forestry project would be implemented. They did so by physically contesting national government attempts to create new forests and by taking advantage of the multiple nodes of power within their post-colonial world, drawing on political relationships that extended all the way up to the office of the president. In so doing, they negotiated new forms of political patronage and helped define the extent of presidential authority. These brief examples make clear that Kenyans contested, transformed, and initiated development in rural spaces. New citizens petitioned for land, resources, and services. They built schools and hospitals at unprecedented rates, regardless of state plans. They refused to market their produce through agricultural cooperatives, and they sabotaged a state-led, internationally financed industrialization program that appropriated land they believed should go to settlement. Though not always successful, Kenyans sought to improve their own lives through creative strategies. In the course of such efforts, they affected modes of development practice, the outcomes of development interventions, and the direction of national planning. In turn, rural actors forged new political subjectivities, helping to define the relationships between citizens, the state, and other institutional bodies. This research has broader implications for historians beyond Kenya and Africa. Many scholars have argued that non-state actors such as NGOs or civil society did not come to play a pivotal role in development until much later. Yet in the early post-colonial era, state actors navigated a complicated development topography that enmeshed local, national, and global politics, and they were never able to determine the practice of development on their own. Indeed, cooperatives and self-help programs made local communities responsible for the labor and administration of their own development, initiating privatization, minimizing the role of the state, and increasing inequality. Such practices laid some of the groundwork for the neoliberal interventions of the 1990s. Looking more carefully at the continuities between the 1960s and the 1990s prompts a major re-examination of global economic history. Doing so could transpose how we think about the second half of the 20th century. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kara, for that wonderful presentation. Don't know why my video is not showing. So if you have questions, please write them on the Q&A, and Dr. Kara Moskowitz will start answering them. Let's see, I think we have one here. Yes. Isaac, do you want to read the question?
Yes, sure. Thank you very much, Dr. Moskowitz, for such a fascinating talk. I will begin asking questions as they come in. There is a question here from Dawson McCall, and it says, you talked about the different spaces and practices through which Kenyans conceptualized and created development, that is schools, agricultural schemes, etc. In your view, how does sporting practice fit into your arguments about how development was practiced and experienced during this period?
Yeah, that's a little bit outside of my focus for the book, but certainly at least in kind of conceptualizing social and community spaces within both the colonial and post-colonial era, the development of sports as part of community development was one of the arenas in which late colonial and early post-colonial leaders focused. So I didn't mention it as much in my self-help, the portion of my paper that focused on self-help, but one of the things that communities did build was, sporting infrastructure, and that was also connected to schooling, of course, which was a focus of the self-help programs. But yeah, sporting is certainly something that's seen as integral to development in a lot of places. I'm not sure if I have too much more to say on it. I've done a little bit of research on sports, and in Kenya, certainly, especially in the colonial period. In the later colonial period, you see a kind of emphasis on the development of sports as a way of, but it has they did it with a colonial mindset, right? As a way of kind of conditioning the body to improve Kenyans, basically. And yeah, those practices continued in the post-colonial era, especially as Kenya gained greater international prestige in global sporting, particularly athletics. Okay.
I have a note here from Dr. Monson, from Dr. Jamie Monson, thanking you for an excellent presentation. She must leave for another meeting and will share her questions and thoughts with you via email.
Okay.
Then there's a question from Jonathan Choti, who asks, Kara, what aspects of the colonial government were carried over to the early post-colonial government, especially regarding self-help efforts and Harambe projects in Kenya?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is something that I wasn't able to talk about as much in the paper, but in the book I go into much greater detail. With a lot of these projects, self-help included, cooperative development included, even the paper factory, the planning for that initially started actually all of those in the colonial era. So you see a lot of continuity with the conceptualization of development practices. Or if you think about the Million Acre Scheme, for example, that begins to be implemented in 1962 prior to Kenya's independence. And because the British and the World Bank were the major funders of those programs, they had a great deal of control about how they were implemented and conceptualized. Self-help grew out of kind of the British welfare state and a desire to focus on helping local communities to help themselves. Kenyatta remade this a little bit because in the colonial era, self-help was largely disliked because it was more imposed, and local people had less options to decide what they wanted to do to help themselves, but instead they were forced to take on specific development projects. And this development often entailed, forced labor, taxation, things like that, that were very much disliked. But the kind of premise of self-help was carried over into the independent era, and discursively, at least, Kenyatta emphasized that people would be able to control their own development and make decisions on their own. That didn't turn out to be carried over into practice as much, but it was something that made self-help much more popular initially, because local people really wanted to control what types of development they instituted and how they instituted it, and whether or not they were forced to contribute to it.
Thank you. Please keep sending your questions to the Q&A section, which is below there. There's one question that has come from Vera Mshana, sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. It says, what lessons can be drawn from your paper in light of the current calls for decolonization of development practice and theory, including key global institutions such as IFIs?
Sure. Yeah, I think one of the major lessons of the paper is that we don't see the decolonization of development practices in the early independent era. So that we see, at least discursively, this emphasis on, Kenyan ownership over development, but in reality, there's so much entanglement between not only state actors, but international development practitioners and all of these financial institutions who are funding these programs. And in relation to the previous question, this carrying over of development plans from the colonial period into the post-colonial period with very little amendment to make sure that they're conceptualized and enacted in a way that benefits local people and takes into account local people's ideas about what constitutes development. So I mean, I guess the big lesson would be to just start over and kind of deconstruct the system that exists. I don't know if, that will practically come into place, but I think in allowing for all of this continuity to occur, and especially with Kenya, at least the big thing that happens is that they don't expropriate land. And so the Kenyan nation comes into independence immediately indebted to these financial institutions, which gives them much less negotiating power and much less leeway with how to implement development nationally.
Okay, thank you. The next question comes from Anne Lutomia, and she says, thank you for your wonderful presentation, Dr. Moskowitz. It sheds light to the roots and routes of land-related tensions Kenyans in the highlands and other spaces experience during election years, and the love we have for land. Having land is read as development. As a Kenyan, I benefited a lot from your presentation. Question, is there a reason as to why you use provinces in your research? This is because the administration of the country is now through counties.
Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, I'm glad that it was helpful. I didn't talk as much about land and land-related tensions as I do in the book. The first 3 chapters actually focus on land. So the first chapter looks at kind of a top-down view of the Million Acre Scheme. The second chapter compares 3 different ethnic groups' experiences of the Million Acre Scheme, all of whom live in close proximity to one another within or close to Uasin Gishu. And then the last chapter looks at squatters and women who were broadly excluded from land resettlement schemes and how that shaped their ideas about citizenship. And the reason why I use provinces in the paper is just because of the time period that I study. So 1945 to 1980, you have a short period of time where you have regions, but then they become provinces again after the Majimbo Constitution is dissolved. So it's hard in some ways to sometimes continually talk about these different regions that have taken on different names, because at the time Uasin Gishu was actually a district and not a county, and of course the counties that exist now differ in their constitution and their boundaries than the districts that existed in the early post-colonial era.
Thank you. Shahida Hendricks comments, thank you very much for an interesting presentation. I learned. Then there's a question from Morgan Robinson. Thanks for the talk. I was struck by the expression you used, quote, citizenship that stresses duties over rights, unquote. This implies, it seems, a set of mutual obligations of citizens to the state and the state to its citizens. Did there come a turning point in the history you've examined in which citizens, feeling that the government was not fully fulfilling its obligations, rejected the idea of their own obligations towards the state? Perhaps after the death of Kenyatta, the paternalistic figure of the nation in a way.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And part of what I try to tease out through the various chapters is thinking of them not necessarily as turning points, but as points in which Kenyans kind of come to conceptualize citizenship and negotiate their ideas of citizenship with the state and all of these other actors. And sometimes come away with, from the negotiations, not with the turnout that they would like, which then produces disappointment or discontentment sometimes in the state. So in the chapter on self-help and also on cooperatives, you're looking at these negotiations about how the state presses certain duties on Kenyans. So with the cooperative development, right, the state created or tried to generate this idea of a sense of citizenship that entailed being a responsible borrower and being a loyal cooperative producer, right? So making sure that cooperative members sold their produce to their cooperatives and thus paid their loans in a timely manner. But obviously, without necessarily always saying it, Kenyans contested those conceptualizations by saying, like, no, I thought that independence would mean I had greater sovereignty and greater rights over how I made financial decisions. I didn't think this would mean more constrictions. And it was similar with self-help as well, right? That you see this kind of battle between local groups who are creating these projects because that was their vision of development, and then expecting the government to step in. And so there's all these kind of turning points, little turning points maybe, where Kenyans think like, oh, initially I thought it was the state's responsibility to provide teachers and nurses, but it turns out that they're not going to do that. And it creates some disappointment, but they also come up with alternative solutions. So that's why you see people kind of solidifying their ethnic affinities and returning to kind of ethnic leaders to look for those resources, or moving towards kind of international institutions and seeing if they can work with NGOs or other governments who are offering to provide aid.
Yes, and then there's a question from Jamil here. It seems to be a broader question that asks if there are any influences from the Somali elite in the Kenyan political and economic system.
I didn't come across that too much in my research. There is one of the things that I tease out more in the book is looking at the ways, at least, in which political parties and politicians generally were so shaped by their ethnic identity, especially with regards to land, and that initially during the independence negotiations produced, these two political parties, KANU and KADU, who are largely defined by the ethnicity and the structure of the government, right? Because KANU wants the government to be centralized and the government to have control over the distribution of land and resources, whereas KADU wants a federal government where regions have much greater control over the distribution of these resources, so that their constituents would have greater access to the Rift Valley. But then as, Kenya becomes a one-party state, you begin to see that those negotiations kind of created disproportionate influence for ethnicity, not that ethnicity didn't continue to be important, but that the kind of political and economic ideologies of some initially Kadu politicians were actually much closer to Kenyatta than some of the KANU politicians. So that's why you see, you know, the rift between Kenyatta and Odinga, for example, that he was, initially they were allied, but they have very different ideas about what the state should look like, what political and economic justice look like. And so you see a kind of switching of a lot of these political leaders. But yeah, as far as influence from the Somali elite, I didn't come across that too much in development program stuff.
Okay, as we wait for others to compose their questions, I will ask one question, Dr. Moskowitz, and it's going to be a broad question. You know, there's a general awareness across Africa of the relationship between African governments and international monetary organizations. I think there was a question earlier on that sort of touched on this. And in French West Africa, for example, there's a continued awareness of the control of those economies through the franc. And, you know, the role of these international organizations to the development or lack thereof on the continent, and the long arm of former colonial powers controlling economic outcomes. From a broad perspective, whether you want to look at it from the Kenyan specific example, or you want to, you know, widen it to generally to other parts of the continent, what do you see as the projection of this relationship? It seems to have been a very long and troubled relationship. And for many Africans, they don't see the benefits. For many Africans, it appears that the people that are in power will relate with these institutions, with European organizations and European governments to buttress their own power, to continue their own reigns. But in actual terms, there's no real benefit for African economies and African peoples. What would your response be to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a fair analysis, and certainly it applies to Kenya, but I think you'd have a hard time finding a place in Africa that it didn't apply to. In Kenya, I think in particular, the thing that I always focus on, because I think it's so essential to so many of the outcomes, even to this day, is the independence negotiations allowing for European settlers' farms to be purchased at market value and on a willing buyer, willing seller basis, which ultimately meant, again, that the Kenyan nation would come into independence highly indebted and beholden to the British. But also just that land was not, they could never make good on the promises for redistributing land, which was at the time and still is the backbone of Kenya's economy, or one of the backbones of Kenya's economy, which meant that there was no attempt to really try to redistribute resources, to come to terms with the sorts of inequalities that colonialism had first produced. And instead it did the opposite, right? It just perpetuated and extended inequalities that had been first introduced under colonialism. And yeah, it's in a lot of ways you see, and this comes back to some of the other previous questions, this continuity and this conceptualization of development. And that if you look at, I mentioned this 1954 land program in Kenya called the Wintertime Plan, which really developed out of the Mao Mao state of emergency. And the whole goal was to create a group of African elites who had similar interests to Europeans, basically. And if you look at the Wintertime Plan and compare it to the Million Acre Scheme, which is supposed to be this program to redistribute land, they look quite similar. And there isn't, aside from trying to settle some squatters who are considered a security risk, there isn't an emphasis on settling people because everyone wants and deserves land. And so I see that as a major issue with the kind of long arm of former colonial powers, because land was so central to these negotiations. But you see it in pretty much every realm, that African countries gained independence on unequal footing within the global economy, and oftentimes had to deal with kind of imposed development programs and took on debt that is not just, in my mind. And we think of a lot of those patterns as starting to occur more often in like the 1980s and 1990s, but I think we can see them beginning in the 1960s for sure, as soon as African countries gained independence.
Well, thank you very much. That was a fascinating talk, and thank you for your thorough answers.
Thank you.
I'm just going to ask one question. It seems to me at the very beginning, the citizens in the rural area were very engaged and have or had some successes. I'm just wondering currently, how engaged are they? Are they very engaged in the political system?
Yeah. I mean, I didn't get to tell the full story of all of these programs, but in a lot of cases, so in the Turbo case, for example, when I stumbled across that in the archives, I was so enamored by the story because it was it seemed like at least this story of success where these squatters said, people who we would normally think of as fairly powerless, they came together and they said, no, this land was promised to us. We're not leaving until we get it. But then when I went and I actually interviewed people, there were a lot of people who ultimately didn't get land still. And there was still some kind of corruption in the way in which that land was distributed, where some of it was given to people who didn't really need land, who had political connections, things like that. And these kind of small compromises that the government made ultimately kind of fractured the political movement, if you could call it that, and that the people who got land were happy enough and kind of forgot about those who remained landless. And I think in a lot of ways that speaks to what Kenyans are very politically engaged, but there's a way in which the government has worked to kind of fracture organizing across what I would think should be more important as class lines, and that Kenyan politics remains, you know, so beholden to kind of ethnic affinity and ethnic identity that oftentimes it allows political leaders to kind of push aside real issues that people are dealing with. But certainly they're politically active. It's just whether or not the results are kind of long-term and kind of what they're looking for beyond a single election.
Thank you.
There is another question here from Veram Shana, and she asks, what 3 things would you suggest reformers should focus on and demand in order to effect change?
What 3 things should
reformers focus on and demand in order to effect change?
Oh gosh, as a historian, this is a little bit beyond me, but I mean, I think transparency is a big one with government. To me, you know, these are only my political opinions, but the redistribution of resources within Kenya, it's one of the most unequal countries in the world. So thinking about how you can make Kenya a more economically just place, what that entails. Does that mean another land redistribution program? Does that mean, I don't know, giving everyone monetary payments each month, but some way of redistributing wealth within Kenya. And then 3, I don't know. Yeah, it could be electoral reform, it could be judicial reform, but yeah, I think the first 2 are the key ones that I would focus on, but I'm not a political scientist.
So those are all our questions.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I wish I could have seen you all in person, but I appreciated the invitation.
that is our wish as well. We wish we had met you in person, but these are the times, and we make do with what we have to deal with here.
Yeah.
Thank you again so much for coming and for your talk. It was very informative. And thank you everybody who attended the talk. We'll see you next Thursday. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.